Hello and welcome to the Cybersecurity and Information Systems Information Analysis Center podcast. Today will be a digest show, and here we will take the 5 most important articles from the Cybersecurity Digest that we release every 2 weeks, and we will discuss the importance of those articles in the world of technology and cybersecurity. My name is Sean Bird.
James Rice.
Nicholas Maida.
And if you would like to know more about our digest, visit www.csiac.org/CS Digest. There you can subscribe to our mailing list and get the CS Digest every 2 weeks with all the articles that we talk about today, including more. So the first article we wanted to talk about today was the Meltdown and Spectre incident. And this isn't necessarily just one article, but just to summarize what happened, multiple security groups recently discovered a flaw in Intel's processing chips, which allows the reading of private kernel memory within the processor and process-to-process communication. This allows malicious attackers to gain access to any and all information passing through the processor's memory, including sensitive information and passwords. This affects all processors made by Intel since 1995, and it also affects some AMD processors, although not to as bad of an extent, I think. Mm-hmm. So this is obviously huge. This is the biggest, I think, one of the biggest stories that has happened in the past few weeks or last couple of months, since it's so widely affecting everybody, and including government systems.
Yeah, the broad application of this is really interesting because I find it, you're always trying to control your security for your devices, but how much of the things and systems that you use you have very little control over. I mean, how many options do we have when it comes to a processor? I mean, there's only so many manufacturers. So when you come out with some type of vulnerability this large, this widespread, it's like, oh no. The other thing that I really found interesting about this was it kind of reminded me a little bit of Heartbleed in the sense of you end up having this vulnerability to which if I were to go back and look at logs, there's no way I could really tell, was I exploited at some point in the last year? So for the most of your monitoring wouldn't pick up the traffic. It just looked too benign, too normal. The last thing that I guess I just have to always poke at these is vulnerabilities like this, although this one was really big, widespread, it's always kind of interesting what kind of branding and logos we continue to come out with these things, because that was one of the big things I remember. I think I remember like the vulnerability score on some of these were not all that high, but then you look at the ones with the logo, they end up being massively published in the news and in the media. Mm-hmm. So you can't have very serious things just because it doesn't have a logo like these do. That you still have to exactly. But this one definitely is I think
the media tends to pick up on the ones that have the flashy logos and
exactly,
stuff like that. And
exactly. So
it's like,
keep that in mind, security researchers.
Yeah.
Talk to your branding department. So.
Yeah. So the impacts of this are absolutely massive because everything in the cloud or even local environments is running on Intel. And this is obviously a huge data breach, I think, in the cloud because a lot of government organizations and private organizations are moving towards the cloud. So VM to VM, container to container, if they're sharing the same processor, they can be you can be looking at each other's information and passwords. And there's some videos out there of Meltdown and Spectre both working to identify some user passwords and stuff like that. So obviously this is huge and it's not easily patched. Meltdown, I believe, Meltdown was easily patched with security patches, but Spectre was a little bit harder to patch.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it depended which operating system were you running on the platform. Were there going to be other unintended consequences? Was there going to be a performance hit? That kind of depended as well.
The performance hit for the Meltdown patch, because I think they put the kernel space into a virtual memory, a separate virtual memory space.
That's correct.
User space.
So user space. So when you're talking about cloud and you have the scaling of hundreds of VMs or even thousands of containers, that has to be a massive performance hit, I would think.
Yeah.
I haven't seen any numbers so far about what that would do to a performance hit for a large scale sort of cloud deployment, but I have to think it would be massive.
Yeah, a lot of the resources that I was certainly looking into when I saw this was depending on what you're actually running, it might vary. You might end up having a bit more impact on one system as opposed to another. but it's going to be noticeable in a lot of those. So
Yeah, it's the older versions of Microsoft. It seems like the impact of the performance is decreased.
Oh, over the older
versions, yeah.
of Microsoft.
Yeah, they're hit harder.
Yeah, and I did find it interesting how the cert fix was change your processor, get rid of your CPU and change it. And they have since changed it now to apply the updates. Yeah. But that was always whenever you see a vulnerability that comes out and it says, well, trash your machine, maybe we should take a look at this. So
I wonder if the AMD stock went up after that.
Take a look, yeah,
because it's such widely.
Well, I'm sure we've got I'm sure we've got a lot more to see, definitely with that one, and for however many systems that can't apply the updates, like it's not like it's going to go away either. So.
Patch all your systems.
Yeah, hardware patching it's pretty difficult. Whereas there's software patches is out right now, but even those are running into some issues right now with rebooting and not able to get their OS up, and just performance impact like we talked about with even these software patches. So
I think it's really hard to patch for Spectre. I think it's harder because it's just the way that Spectre itself works, but it's also hard to implement the hack and the exploit.
It's hard,
so good news and bad news all at the same time. So the next article I wanted to go over, a little bit more lighthearted, but still very serious. Romanian hackers take control of Washington, D.C. surveillance cameras before the presidential inauguration back in January of 2017. Romanian hackers took control of 123 D.C. police cameras out of 187 that they use. The cameras were inoperable and unable to record for multiple days. 5 total Romanian hackers were arrested in relation to this hack and are awaiting prosecution. The hackers took control of computers with access to these camera systems and attempted to ransomware access to them from the D.C. police, and I think in turn the Secret Service. D.C. police then seemingly wiped and reset all infected systems and were able to get the camera systems back online. I think we talked a little bit about this last episode, but the ransomware becoming something that is used for political activism and or financial activism. I'm not even sure that the Romanian hackers knew that it was. I don't even know if they targeted because it was Inauguration Day and they knew that it was a crucial system for that.
Yeah, we don't know.
I'm not sure. I think it might have been kind of a coincidence, but who knows?
I really think, though, when you look at something like this, that's not even the important point. Like, okay, it affected the Secret Service. I don't care if it affected, Joe down the road. You still look and say, what are the systems that are being infected and what are the new attack vectors that are coming out? And we increasingly see all these end sensors that are running who knows what type of platform. Maybe it's running a Linux platform that is updated, maybe it's not. So something like that is the trend that we've continuously seen, and we've seen that merge with ransomware. We've seen that merge with random attacker can go on the internet, scan for vulnerable device, and I don't care if it's a refrigerator or a security camera. I don't care if it's owned by the Secret Service or a local police station. I still can have effect, and I can click a button and do that.
Yeah.
And that certainly plays into this. When is this going to change?
I think we're going to keep seeing more and more of this. If people are getting away with it and getting these ransoms collected, I think we'll see more of this hit, not large scale, but like local financial institutions and local police departments, stuff like that, where they don't have the budget for a cybersecurity implementation, like a strong cybersecurity implementation to ward against these sorts of things.
Yeah, as long as we see this increase with IoT, the Internet of Things, we're going to see more vulnerabilities like this, I believe. People just trying to push these out quick and, and making life more convenient. Yeah, and they don't really consider all the security aspects of things. So.
Yeah, we saw this recently happen with the botnet, too, that was created by security cameras a couple months ago, where they ended up just doing a distributed denial of service attack by taking over all these endpoints. Yeah. So same idea, we're now going to maybe be a little bit more targeted, have some type of ransomware attack. The process is going to continue. Now, I did find it interesting, or at least just something to note, would be whenever we have an attack like this, how much of it is the end sensor and how much of it is the server that these end sensors might report to. Yeah. So long as it ends up staying the end sensor, at least now we can maybe try to identify the problem.
I think this was more like the central. It wasn't the central server, but it was the computer systems that were accessing the camera systems. So it might have been 5 different systems accessing 20 cameras apiece. or
Right.
or 25 cameras a piece, something like that. But infecting those systems with how they didn't say how they got in. I don't think it might
Yeah,
have been
I
like
didn't
an
see
email or
details on
something
that.
like
So that's the point that I wanted to make, though, was to be aware where is the vulnerability, because we've seen, as soon as Nick said, as soon as we start talking about IoT, there's a range of problems. Like there's plenty of good work to be done there, to in terms of improvements. But let's be specific whenever we look at an attack to say, was it a software problem? Was it a centralized server problem? Was it a distributed, the sensor itself is just out of date and that's the problem? So, I mean, in the bottom line here for this incident, I'm happy they were able to simply just reinstall and fix the
Yeah.
issue. But I mean, how many
that's
other
why I
people have
worry
that camera?
like a financial institution where you couldn't just wipe and reinstall the operating system or anything like that, because you have all these personal records, or even a healthcare, like a health insurance organization. That would be really catastrophic, I would imagine. So just to move on here to a couple other stories before we get into our last one, the EU data localization story. The EU General Data Protection Regulation, to be enforced on May of 2018, which requires strict regulations on the transport and storage of personnel data across servers located in multiple countries. Cloud providers in Europe are now scrambling to build systems that align with these new regulations. Now, I think this has a huge impact on cloud, not only in Europe, but probably going to impact the U.S. a little bit as well, and across the world, because these cloud service providers now have to reimagine their infrastructure so that they have certain servers in each country in order to host this personnel data, and also they have to conform to regulations if they do want to transport data between, say, Britain and France. They would have to conform to very specific regulations on how they hold and transport that data. So I wonder if things are going to move that way in the U.S. As we have more of these vulnerabilities, these cloud vulnerabilities kind of propagate throughout the system.
Yeah, one of the interesting, I guess, culture differences I'd like to kind of it was made aware to me, was I was watching a documentary one time. It was by General Michael Hayden. He was the former director of NSA and CIA. And so he was in there post 9/11 as NSA director. And he was talking in a post-Snowden era about the breaches, about the data. And when he was doing a lot of the same information he was talking about here over there in Europe, he said he got a lot more European pushback on the privacy issue. And so he said there's a culture difference here. Us as Americans, we don't quite understand. We are very much, that First Amendment freedom of speech. We're quite passionate about that here in America. That's the way they are over there when it comes to privacy. And I found that very interesting. Like, if I've never lived in Europe, I might not realize what is the impact and importance and the culture differences as soon as you say the word privacy in the internet. And so that's something that came across really strong over there, was the private. And so something like this is very consistent with that. We've seen lots of countries in Europe, in Eastern Asia, and that's been a really big trend. But in the same sense, how much of that has been driven by their culture, and we might not necessarily have seen that over here in the States.
Culture, I think, is a little bit more of, well, if you have nothing to hide, then why do you need that certain level of privacy? And over there, it's more of that standard and keeping that privacy for everybody.
Exactly. But I think that this article definitely brought up a good point, which was these are international organizations. Like Google needs to operate in all of the above, or whoever. Apple needs to be able to operate in all of the above. So this creates a lot of policy issues for these, what we have, large international organizations that kind of quote unquote run the internet or run technology on a large scale. So it's going to increasingly create a lot of, I think, policy issues, or policy meets technology problems when you're talking about building something. Because now I need to build a product that I want to sell across the world to all my users, but it needs to fundamentally operate differently based on which country it's in. So it's definitely a trend that doesn't seem to be going away, but I don't know if it's going to necessarily be here in the States. So it's quite as heavily.
I just wonder if sorry, were you gonna?
No, I'm good.
I just wonder if cloud service providers are going to have to, if they're going to make like a blanket sort of kind of policy or infrastructure way that they're deploying things that would reflect over there. It would just be easier for a company to deploy it over there the same way they deploy over here, and vice versa. So one last story that I wanted to talk about before we close up here and a lot of the other stories kind of relate back to this, is the updates to the NIST cybersecurity framework. On May 11th, 2017, President Donald Trump signed an executive order calling for all government organizations to adhere to the framework for improving critical infrastructure cybersecurity provided by NIST, to include a risk assessment of all systems within 90 days. Some changes have been made to the framework lately, and we have the 5 updates here, and we just wanted to talk about those and how they relate to some of the articles maybe today. The first one was they added 4.0 self-assessing cybersecurity risk with the framework. And mainly, I think that kind of just says that they didn't want organizations to follow the framework blindly and the regulations that they have set out in there. They wanted to be them to be like fully aware of the infrastructure that they were implementing and the limitations of it, so they weren't just saying, okay, well, we checked that box.
Yeah, we've seen that trend across the board. Take all our rules, but do a risk assessment as you actually implement, because we realize that no organization looks exactly like another. So it's quite consistent with that push.
So they added also some clarifications on the framework's involvement with the cybersecurity supply chain, and how information is created and disseminated to multiple pieces. Are you guys familiar? I'm not as familiar with the cybersecurity supply chain as a model in itself. Are you guys more familiar with that?
Well, one of the issues with the supply chain is kind of feeds into the other article there with the security cameras, and that is how many of these pieces that we're using were made by someone else, and do we have any control, or to what extent do we have even awareness, let alone control, of where did the things come from? And that's really what your supply chain effort is trying to do, is to say, I know where it's manufactured, I know where the software gets added, and I actually know where the vendors are, all the way to me buying it in the store or buying it online. So,
and then using it in your infrastructure.
Exactly. Yeah. So, and the reality is, it's easy to make the joke, it's all made in China, but I don't know where, or by whom, and that's something that certainly comes across when you're looking at the technology like this.
Yeah, it's important to identify and assess and mitigate and know where that supply is going down, knowing where everything's being done at.
And keeping catalog of that.
Keeping catalog,
for sure.
Yeah, sure.
Mm-hmm.
They also wanted an emphasis on authentication to your whatever systems that you're hosting or accessing. And I think that is not lacking in government organizations, but it definitely could be improved upon. It's that usability triangle, right? Security versus usability and all that. But having more authentic, like 2-factor authentication for most things, having password, PIN, biometric, card security, and your CAC and stuff like that. Having all of that implemented, having all of that implemented, it's a pain for organizations to, I think, do all of that and keep maintaining the maintenance of all that. But obviously, it's worth it.
I think there's some teething issues where it's like, I don't want to do more security. I see nothing but cost.
Yeah.
But in the same sense, when I turn around and say, yeah, but look at massive breach that happened because someone did a phishing email and stole a password or clicked on a link.
Exactly.
And we've realized, or we need to start to accept that passwords are not sufficient anymore. Your basic authentication methods might not be enough. And I see it as a blanket move, or just something that's happening in our security culture, to say, starting to accept, okay, grumble along, accept some of these costs. Yeah. You've accepted the benefit that this stuff has worked very well for a long time. Now all the risks are catching up with us. Got to start taking another look at some of this. So what the real costs are, let's say.
They also implemented a section on the sharing of vulnerabilities across domains and organizations. And I think that's obviously super important if the left hand is not talking to the right. And one organization, say the NSA gets hacked by one thing, but they don't share it with the CIA or whatever insert organization acronym here. If they don't share those vulnerabilities, how can we protect across different organizations within the DoD and abroad, or even commercially? So in the commercial sense, I see like bug reports or bug bounties and stuff like that. Oftentimes, I don't even think these are reported or made public when these bounties are collected upon. And I think it's probably better once these are patched and fixed to share openly.
Sure, yeah.
With,
so others won't.
Yeah, with other companies and organizations, so that everybody can be protected. And there's a fine balance there, I think, to kind of maintain.
I have seen the push more towards a responsible disclosure mainly because, and especially what a lot of the bug bounty programs kind of established was, if I'm a researcher or an analyst, I can actually create a stream of money for myself by doing this responsibly, reporting the bug, and make a living doing this. So once you kind of have that, now all of a sudden there is the benefit. We have a system, a model we can kind of follow, and that sort of feeds into that. But when you're talking about things just as massive as what we were talking about, like the Meltdown and the Spectre, it's like, yeah, how these things, did it get posted on the internet by a random guy working on his PhD, or did it go through appropriate channels to give some of the manufacturers a little bit of a head start for patching?
I think there was three different groups that had found the Meltdown and Spectre vulnerabilities and reported it to Intel before it actually was made public. It wasn't supposed to be made public yet because the patch and fix were very rushed out there because that was made public. So that's all the time we have for today. If anyone would like to see the articles that we talked about today, they will be in the show notes below the show, the video on the website. If you would like to subscribe to the CS Digest, again, visit www.csiac.org/CS Digest to just subscribe to our bi-weekly CS Digest and get all these articles and more. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We'll see you.
Thanks.
Did you know that CSIAC offers free monthly webinars featuring experts in the areas of cybersecurity, software engineering, modeling and simulation, and knowledge management? Come see leading industry professionals talk about industry practices and leading research. Make sure to visit www.csiac.org/webinars in order to subscribe to our mailing list and see when the next webinar series is available. There you can also watch previous webinar series to catch up. Visit www.csiac.org/webinars.